This government meeting is brought to you by Eastworks and our local cable subscribers.
All right, there we go. All right, great. Welcome everybody. Thank you. This is it's May 24th. This is a meeting of the Elementary School Reuse Committee. Joe McCoy is the acting chair for the committee, and he's absent today. And I think Pat Brough also is absent. Brad Riley is not here. So we are just going to move forward. We have a bit to cover as we move through this process. There was an email with some materials attached sent recently, and I'm just working on posting the information to the webpage. So we have a webpage for the project. So after the meeting, all the information that we're talking about today will be there, along with the list of all the other things that have been accumulated for the project. I think Ben's here representing Mass Development, and Ben, maybe we will start with some of the plans, the concept plans that your team kind of helped prepare. Do you want to say anything about them before we kind of show them on the screen, or do you want to just add?
I think the only thing that I'll contribute towards that is that I know there's some small changes that are being made, and I heard from VHB this morning that they should be ready and sent out by tomorrow. So
great, I appreciate that. And now as I get lost in my screen, I'm gonna try. There's one relatively major change that was discussed, and I made a note using I'm letting Claire, and I made a note using just PDF to show that would change sort of in the final version. And so let me see if I can pull this up.
If not, Jeff, I have them.
Okay, would you be willing to do that? Because
yeah.
I'm getting lost quickly here in the reads too. Whichever one you want to pull up first, we'll look at them. The other thing I think is worth adding is that these are just ideas. This is sort of like to demonstrate what could potentially fit on the actual properties themselves. And so Valley CDC provided some information earlier on what could potentially fit inside the buildings, just as a fit test to kind of just give us a sense of where we are at. And this is the same general idea with the properties itself. And then one thing that we've talked about it as a group and see in the future is that if there is a redevelopment of any of the school properties, some of the sidewalks and other infrastructure is pretty old around the buildings, around the school properties. And there are often opportunities to apply for state grant funds to upgrade the surrounding facilities to complement, a project. And so we're showing kind of these ideas that came through multiple of the community meetings that we did as part of the downtown plan. So Emily, is there a way to zoom in a little bit on this one? This is Maple Street.
Absolutely.
I'll just kind of give a quick overview of what we're looking at, but the white building, the white on that part of the screen is the actual existing Maple Street School. The street in front of Maple is called Chapel Street, and what this shows is that through public infrastructure changes, there could be some reconfiguration of some of the sidewalks in front to sort of formalize public parking that's on-street parking. And as you go up Chapel towards Maple, there's enhanced crosswalks that are shown. The sidewalk would kind of bump out and turn around Maple Street, and it provides one additional parking space on Maple Street. And then that next block is a series of 3 crosswalks that do exist today, but for pedestrian safety goals, one option would be to make this a raised crosswalk where the vehicles would slow down because they have to traverse kind of a raised area. And then as you continue to the right side of Maple Street, some sidewalk changes, are just considered. This is all not even proposed, it's conceptual. But then what we really get into on the site is there's green space shown along Maple Street, and through those downtown planning meetings, that was one of the neighborhood requests, was if there was going to be a park maintained, that it could actually be better if it was oriented to that neighborhood. Those are, people who live in that neighborhood and would have kids potentially, or people who want to use a park space. So the idea is just to show that there is space on that side, which is in line with what we heard in 2020. And then sort of the fit test stuff is to show that the paved area behind Maple, is pretty large, and using kind of dimensions for parking spaces and dimensions for access. And we did talk to the fire department. So the fire department, in the future design of a plan, the fire department would have some access requirements for their larger trucks to go around the building. So all of that is kind of fit into this fit test to show that it's feasible to fit 34 parking spaces, which is around the number that Valley CDC would have shown for their number of units. And then on the bottom of the page is kind of where the area is now, where the playground is at Maple Street, showing the potential for, and Emily, maybe if you pull the map up a little bit, just we can see.
Yep.
Potential for 15 public parking spaces, in theory at least fits on the property. And as we've talked about before, those kind of elements are the community benefits that we have highlighted in the RFP. So this was a way for us to demonstrate that it is possible. It is not definitive in any way, but we did want to give a sense that the things that we're asking for are not unattainable or unrealistic. And then there's a crosswalk shown to cross Chapel Street. So it's an area that if you've been over there, it's not up to standards. There's a curb, there's markings that lead you across to another curb, and so those don't meet the ADA requirements. So the idea is that we have this conceptual plan. We also have gathered the survey, the actual land survey information that the city does not have until we have this project, and now we have this land survey information. And then Emily, maybe if you go to the top of the page and then show us Maple Street going down towards the downtown. So this was just an example. This is one scenario that maybe could play out in the future, is to make this corridor more pedestrian friendly. That was one of the desirable features of a project, is to connect that whole neighborhood, the Maple Street neighborhood area, more on sidewalks, more to the downtown. I will say that there are some informal parking spaces along Maple Street, especially the bottom of Maple Street, that would potentially be removed to accommodate a more pedestrian-oriented street. But those spaces are problematic in a couple of ways because they're crammed between driveways. They probably are technically not meeting current standards for parking. So this is an area that would have to be fleshed out in greater detail moving forward. But the idea would be to switch a couple of the parking spaces there, accommodate them on Chapel Street, and accommodate them potentially, in a small parking lot for public parking. So I will pause for a minute and see if anyone has questions, because I know I'm kind of going through this kind of quick, but this is all, again, just conceptual. And what we're going to try to do in a few minutes is, in the RFP, we have references to community benefits. And then for each of the sites, it's described that these were kind of the desirable features that we'd like to see. And we make reference to this plan so that people could see that this is available for people who will be looking at the properties. So I think with that, I'll stop for a second and see if anyone has any questions. Chris, go ahead.
Can you zoom back over to the school part, or the part that actually shows the school? That I might have missed something. I just want to confirm, but those were two green spaces. They're not two different plans or proposals, right?
Correct. I think it's intended to just show that what we heard and what we see on Maple Street is it's a lot of pavement. So in theory, this configuration is one option, but it would result in other green space being available for whether it's the tenants or public.
Right, and that was my follow-up. These would be available to the public, right? There's no liability issues.
It's a good question. I think it's a detail that would come with a proposal. I think that the notion of the community benefit would be that especially at least one of these would be available to the public and would be, like a public park. And so there might be liability issues that would get clarified, but generally if it's, it's probably not a big concern if we, come to an agreement with a developer in the future that this is open to the public, then that would be sort of the target.
Thanks.
Pamela.
Could the green spaces be connected and, like switched with the parking spaces? So it's one big green space instead of two smaller ones?
I'm guessing that it's probably possible. This configuration was arranged just for simplicity, I think, to show that the public parking could be kind of on one side. I think there are probably 6 different ways that this could be designed. Just as a random number, like there's many different configurations. I think Emily, there's a reference in the RFP that would just sort of observe that safe pedestrian connections within the site would be important. So Pam, I think your question is good. I think we couldn't explore every possible arrangement, but I think that it's feasible for someone to find a way to connect the green spaces. We just didn't get to that level of detail with showing that.
And I zoomed in because I just wanted to show, and you'll see this on the other one as well, that there's a proposed gate here that would allow for fire access all the way around. But the reason the gate is there is to separate the tenant parking from the public parking. And so while there might be a possibility for a layout that could connect the green spaces, again, if there's a difference between tenant green space and public green space, you might want to, the developer will probably want to make sure that there's some sort of differentiation between them. So as Jeff said, this being conceptual, yeah, there are other layouts that could happen and could be reviewed as part of the process. But this one at least indicates the possibility of a public space versus a private space.
I see. I was thinking of children playing in a park and being around less moving cars. Yeah. That's all.
Yeah, one of the we actually had talked back and forth too about which was public and which was private, and the idea that a public space that was at the very tail end of a bunch of parking might be a little nerve-wracking for parents if they were letting their kids play by themselves, whereas this is visible from the street. But again, there's probably other ways of doing this. There's also space left over that could be greened up and planted. That's not showing that at the moment because it's not the green is differentiating usable space versus landscape space at this point, or potentially usable space.
And I think, Pamela, help us when we get into the RFP document, which we do want to go over. There was a couple of red line changes. I think I would like to revisit your question. Mm-hmm. We added a section in there about making sure that the sidewalks provide connections, and maybe there's a way we could express the potential desirability of having the green spaces connected. When a team is looking at this, they will really sharpen their pencils and get into what makes the most sense for if they have tenants and a public space. They'll have to come up with some kind of configuration, but we can kind of nudge them in that direction. Mm-hmm. So that was a really good question.
It's a great idea for preservation of wildlife, whether it's, pollinators accessing more gardens or birds or whatever too. So I like the idea.
So can I follow up a question with what you just said, Jeff? Mm-hmm. When a proposal is eventually selected, will it then go through the normal planning process and it can be modified as you go? Like a question like this.
Yes. Yep. So a proposal in the future selected would need to go to the planning board for the site plan approval process. And so the very particulars, the very specific things about how a person might walk through the site is definitely something that could be, it would be considered.
Okay.
So that is kind of, yeah, that's a great question. That does happen. I just think that our goal, right, from the beginning was to push, kind of front load these ideas to the front to see if, then it's in the evaluation criteria that if they can accommodate these things up front, their chances of getting selected to pursue the project are higher. And that's ultimately the goal. And then the particulars would get sorted out through a public hearing process.
That would be a good FAQ. It might be in the timeline originally. I just can't remember.
Mm.
The planning portion, I mean.
Yep. Yeah, I'm making a note of that. So when we get into the FAQ, we'll see if there's a spot to fit that in. I think that's good. And I'll just make another quick note is that the timeline, Emily, and if you'll help me keep track of this, but I think we have talked to a couple groups. So the school committee, for example, we did tell them that this is, so when we release this RFP, there are not shovels in the ground right away. I mean, this could be years while everything that is associated with a project takes shape. That may be good to have in the FAQ that this is not next spring if we select someone. I think that's a really good observation. Great, and we can come back, but maybe Emily, do you have the ability to switch us to the Senator Pepin site?
Yep, just a moment. I have to switch from one to the other.
Great, and then maybe you could bring us to the red areas just to start with what is not going to be on the plan. We definitely, we're not moving fast, but we are trying to package everything up so that we can get it more towards the city council process. So in the vein of trying to show all the concepts to this group, we had a meeting. It was late last week. This is the end of School Street. So School Street starts on Union, comes through, and then comes out on Center. And this area is pretty highly utilized when you're, if you're like a parent, like my kids go to Center, and parents park here in the morning and they park here in the afternoon. But generally speaking, most other times, this is not a highly sought after area for parking. So the first request to the team at Mass Development was find as many on-street parking spaces as possible. And they did that. But if you look at the word School Street on this map and to the right of it, what happens by trying to get these 4 parking spaces is that the road would shift to the right and it would consume people's front yard. It's technically the city owns that, but it would be perceived as their front yard. And so the discussion that we had was that those 4 parking spaces are not worth that. We don't expect them to be of high value or like highly utilized. So the plan should just revert back to making sure that the sidewalk on that left side is just ADA compliant. So it would just be fixed in place and without any significant changes to that part of the road. And then, so maybe if you want to shift, so we can see the rest of School Street. So School Street, if you look at the label here on School Street, it kind of just ends on the right side. That is where the Union Street project connects. So we are expecting Union Street to go under construction this summer. And it will be a while. It's going to be like a year. It's going to be like a 2-year project, but the sidewalks on Union Street will be upgraded to that point. And the idea is that this project would pick that up and continue the upgrade of the sidewalk. Right now, again, conceptual is that there's a half on the bottom of the School Street. It shows proposed 2 public parking spaces. Right now, there's a sidewalk there that if you really look at the way that street interacts with the Dunkin' Donuts and the Pride, there's a section of sidewalk that no one uses. It's just a sidewalk to nowhere on both sides. So the conceptual proposal would be to remove that sidewalk and upgrade the sidewalk on the other side. And that would be where pedestrians would go. And we gain 2 parking spaces here, which, because most of this is oriented towards Union Street in terms of people wanting to park, that seemed potentially worth it. And then we move into the school property itself. And so the same idea during the public input process that we had was that housing was really important. Public parking was important, as was a park. And so what this shows is, Center School has a very large playground and then a paved area next to it. And without school-age children being there, we can reuse that space. So the conceptual design here shows off of School Street. On this side, it's within an eye shot of Union Street. So that's generally a good thing, is to be able, if you can see it from your destination, then people are more likely to go there to park. So this shows 15 public parking spaces with the same idea, Pamela, that we had on the other end, was there would be an emergency vehicle gate just for simplicity purposes, to show that this public parking could be separate from tenant parking, which we think generally that a person looking to build housing units would want to make sure that their tenants have spaces available to them, and then the public parking would be available for freer use. So same idea. The fire department has looked at this with the mass development team and determined that a ladder truck is the largest vehicle, can come down Clark Avenue and circle around the school. And what's left is 20 tenant parking spaces, which is more than what the Valley CDC fit test kind of said was necessary. So there's a little bit of wiggle room in this so-called fit test. Then in general terms, and this is the part where it goes into being a conceptual design, there's no guarantee, there's no requirement that this happen, but making the connection down Clark Avenue, because it's not going to be a school anymore. This could become a traveled way for cars. But the idea would be that we would want to upgrade the sidewalk to make it a pedestrian connector through to the other side. So that's kind of shown where anywhere there's a driveway, it would become ADA accessible. And then there's a couple trees in front of Pepin. And then we just shift some of the parking spaces in front of Pepin, just change in configuration a little bit to better accommodate the handicapped accessible parking that would be required. The large lot on the page, at the top of the page, is associated with the Pepin property, but as of right now, it just doesn't really show any changes there. So it's a pretty adequate parking lot. And then kind of the last 2 areas here are on Park Street. The idea of connecting to the Veterans Park and the library would be another upgraded pedestrian crossing on Park Street, along the same lines as the other one, which is a raised crosswalk with the rapid flashing beacon lights to just really better protect pedestrians as they're trying to cross. So kind of again, that this is a concept plan and it may be useful. It may not be what we get. But the value that we are really appreciative of getting from mass development is that we have we actually have the land survey data for this entire area, which without that, we can't even talk about potential improvements to the public infrastructure. So I'll stop and see if we have any questions about this kind of concept plan. Great. We can always circle back. It's not a problem. I just, it is something we want to show the committee. And again, we want to tie it to the RFP to just, again, show that we're not at financially, it could be different. What can really be done financially, but at least in terms of a fit test, in terms of the site and the dimensions that exist, we do think it's reasonable for us to be talking about some kind of public parking, some kind of public park, and then, the parking that would be necessary for units. So I think from here, Emily, what was your suggestion?
I thought we'd talk about you have the CPA letter of support and the library emails, maybe just a quick update on those.
Okay, yes. So in the packet, I think it's for informational purposes. I'll start with the library, is that the Emily Wilson Library has been going through some various planning exercises for looking at the long-term vision for the library. And they recently, so I was informed by their board of directors that they recently voted that they were not going to pursue the school properties as potential locations for the new library. And they, in the email, they cite a couple different things. One of which is that the state has a funding program for building new libraries, and there's a long list of communities who are in the queue for that. And the process to get into that queue takes a location and time and effort. And they are projecting that they're at least 5 years away from being eligible for the state funding source for a library. And then I think that the other thing that they observe is that generally speaking, the state funding source doesn't generally fund renovation of older buildings. They fund the construction of new buildings that would meet all current code requirements and be more efficient, really. So those two things combined, I think, are causing them to demonstrate that they're not going to be bidding on this. And I think that was informative for this committee, and I think it'll be informative for city council, because I think as we go into the public process with the city council, I think that they might expect to hear, from people, residents, about what about the library, and trading a small old building that has a lot of code issues for a larger old building with a lot of code issues. It doesn't give them the value proposition that they're looking for. So that email is in the packet. The other thing recently is I went to the Community Preservation Act Committee. So as we heard from Valley CDC a while ago, that funding is going to be really important, and anything the city can do to make the sites appealing for people to be choosing to locate in Easthampton is important. And one of those funding sources is the CPA. So we have it's a pretty generic letter, but it is intended. So we had a discussion with CPA that their financial contribution will likely be part of the equation moving forward. Without specific details or a specific number, the CPA committee sort of unanimously voted in support of using CPA funds for a project that provides affordable housing. And if a project is selected that meets the evaluation criteria, then they will be at the table with that developer to offer some level of financial support. And so that was all felt to be pretty important to be incorporating into the RFP, so that a potential developer will see that the CPA committee is aware that this is happening, and that they understand that there would likely be some kind of financial commitment.
Jeff?
Yes.
The CPA is that like a state agency or?
Oh, great question. So it's a committee that Easthampton has, and the committee administers the Community Preservation Act funds, which are collected via real estate transactions in Easthampton. And so every real estate transaction generates a small percentage of funds that goes into CPA. And the CPA funds can be used for three general purposes. One is historic preservation. One is open space and recreation. And then the third is affordable housing. And so, I've been to many CPA committee meetings, and a lot of times people say, well, let's pave some roads like this, because there's over $1 million in this account, that it changes and evolves, and there is a state contribution to it as well. And so they carefully monitor and they pick projects that they can fund, that that are eligible in those 3 eligible buckets. But a lot of people, say pave a road and it doesn't fit in one of those 3 categories. And so we've done, in Easthampton generally, we've done a fantastic job of buying open space and protecting land and providing recreational opportunities. And we have done some historic preservation. The big project that, if you have heard, that is kind of slated for CPA funds is Old Town Hall. So that requires a significant investment to bring an elevator. That's falling under the historic preservation bucket. And then the city has not found or had a great project for affordable housing that CPA funds can be positioned for. And so that's one of the things that we think this could be a good project for the CPA committee who wants to fund the construction of more affordable housing. So it's kind of a long explanation of that.
No, that was helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. That was a good question. Okay, Emily, I definitely feel like I'm talking a lot. So what would be the next best thing to touch on? Is it the FAQ or?
I think the FAQ would be great. Let me see. Did I have that up? Yes, I do have that up. Just 2 seconds. And that is the draft RFP, and there is a draft FAQ. I can put that up. Do you want to kick off? Do you want me to kick off? How do you want to do that?
Would you like to do that? That'd be great.
No problems at all. So you had seen an earlier draft of this. Lauren had given us some excellent comments. Thank you, Lauren. And Jeff and I collectively have put together, a revised version, which obviously he sent out to you. I think one of the questions that came up today about the timeline and the public approval process, I think that's something that should definitely be added. But if we just go through quickly the questions that are in there, do you see anything else that should be added to this? So we have, why would the city want to sell? Why should the RFP be flexible? Can these buildings be demolished? Scroll through, make you all dizzy. What are the community benefits? Why should it be a private developer? Why doesn't the city keep the buildings? Why is the best use affordable housing? Why don't we make this a parking garage, or at least Maple Street a parking garage? What happens if the city gets no responses? And then again, I think adding timeline, adding approval process. Anything else that you've heard that you think that should be addressed in this FAQ to sort of answer any questions that might be going through the community at this point? Or anything that you've had questions on maybe at the beginning of the process that have been answered through this process, but you think somebody else might have a question about?
I think I appreciate that, Emily. And I think the only thing I would add is that going to the Community Preservation Act Committee to hear the discussion, and the school committee, that was a good one that Chris mentioned, is the timeline. The school committee I think they appreciated the fact that they knew that this wasn't an imminent, we've released this and all of a sudden there's something happening at the schools. Mm-hmm. The discussion about parking, comes up frequently, and we hadn't had the question in there before. But the important thing, I think, for people to understand is that a parking garage is a huge investment from the city. It's an enormous cost. And the concern that we would have as a community is that to go from our current parking management strategies now, which is really almost nothing, just to immediately to a parking garage, it skips many steps that are available to other communities. Even we've the most minimal, the most we've done is put out A-frame signs that say public parking and a banner, and that is pretty minimal for efforts to direct people to parking. We don't have a map of where public parking is. We're not doing anything to really incentivize people to park in different areas. And I think one of the observations moving forward is that Cottage Street in particular gets very busy, and that's a really positive thing for the businesses on Cottage Street. The businesses are concerned about parking, but right now, as it stands, there are 97 parking spaces at Town Hall, and we can't get people to go. We can't get people to park there, and it's free. And so if we go through this process of thinking about a parking garage at Maple Street, and we would expect people to have to pay a fair amount. First, the taxpayers of Easthampton would have to fund the construction of the garage. And then to even get any of the maintenance fees covered, people would have to pay to park in the garage. The rest of our system for parking is free. People will not go in that paid parking garage. And so it has come up, and I'm not trying to mix up the whole conversation, but when you have chatter around town and you mention the idea of parking meters, there's a instant negative reaction towards that amongst most of the community. And so we are nowhere even near the idea of parking meters, which would be one of the steps along this continuum of if we really have a parking problem, we need to employ some of these strategies that other communities do. It seems highly desirable anecdotally that we do not have paid parking. It's a feature of Easthampton that's really nice, but I think to go right to a garage is very challenging. And so we're just trying to hit that one in the head, like straight ahead, and say that those are costs that the residents would bear first, and then it just financially doesn't seem feasible in the long run. So we're trying to be firm with some of these responses. I think the other one was in terms of selling the properties for $1. It goes to this idea that we are inviting people to come to Easthampton and invest lots of money into these buildings and to try to provide what we have as goals. So for affordable housing, we really need to be trying hard to make it so they would choose Easthampton rather than choosing some other community. So every community needs affordable housing, and there are a lot of communities who are looking for projects or developers to fulfill their needs. So we do have to be ready to talk about this as one of the ways we can really incentivize getting the things that we want as a community. Emily, were there other things that we talked about? The demolition. I think it was in a previous version, but just to be clear, so the demolition is possible, but the expectation would be higher for a developer who would come in and say they want to remove a building. There would be a community meeting required, and then we talked about the energy standards and things like that, and then more units.
I'm just skimming through to see if there were any others that we, the making the community benefits clear, I think we talked about in the past. And then just a little bit more information. I think we added to why doesn't the city keep the buildings? So about the costs of maintaining and operating. And then just a note that no other department has, and that's partly why the library letter was so important, that no other department has indicated a need for this space. So, and that's important to know. You don't want to keep 3 empty buildings around. So other than that, I think we've covered everything that was a major change on that. Again, I agree that I think having both the timeline is a new question and the public process, that there will be a public process as part of the redevelopment, and what that involves is a big piece. So we can work on adding the language for that. So, and I was just looking, Jeff, actually, as you were talking, I think it might be worth calling out how close the current parking behind City Hall is to Cottage Street versus how far away a parking garage would be in Maple Street. We might actually want to put the distances there, because if they won't park for free behind City Hall and walk, it's an even further walk in some cases to the Maple Street school. So why pay to park in a parking garage and walk even further?
I think that's a good addition.
Yeah. And then just as a note for you all, I don't think we need to put it in here, but when I and colleagues of mine do fit studies and we start estimating the costs of development, we typically use around $8,000 for a paved surface parking space and $30,000 for a garage space, a structured garage space. You know, those flip around. I think it used to be 25,000, and it's gone up in recent years. But just as our back of the envelope calculations, and that's just an order of magnitude for you all to know between surface and garage parking. So I think with that, Jeff, the last piece is just checking in on the RFP. Let me pull up, and actually I'll go ahead and scroll to some of the changes so I don't make everybody completely dizzy on that. Let me pull up one of the first ones. So Jeff had mentioned changing some of the language in here to address some of the more recent changes. So the CPA funding that he mentioned earlier is added in there. And then I am going to make you dizzy, I'm sorry. You can see just a lot of tweaks in terms of language and a couple of typos here and there with several people wandering through and making changes. You always get a couple of extra. We added here the discussion of the conceptual design for the two. This is an example. It's in both schools that was looked at, but the idea that there is a conceptual design to demonstrate options for the reconfiguration of public infrastructure and public parking. But making it clear that the respondent is not bound to this plan. So we don't expect to see them reproducing it exactly, and then that there's infrastructure grants that the city will use to support this. So establishing the fact that the city and the developer will work in partnership to realize these community benefits. And then same thing here. Oh, this was the public access to the gym. This also notes that, again, I think it was there before, but it's worth calling out this idea that, and I'm just going to use this as an example throughout, that we call out that rehabilitations to the school have to think about how it contributes to the context. So we call that out wherever possible. Here's another part of the connections. This is the piece that we were talking about earlier when Pamela brought up the idea of connecting the open spaces, that the respondent has to include safe pedestrian connections from the building to tenant parking, any tenant open space, and the public sidewalk. So there's always a clear connection there. And also that the respondent must include safe pedestrian connections from the public sidewalk to any public parking and or public playgrounds. So again, that you have a clear path. And then above that, this was an earlier one that we had in there. They also have to have a wayfinding signage program that actually welcomes the public in so that they know that they are welcome to park there. And it's not just public parking that is potentially for the public. The public has no idea that they can actually use it. We changed the respondents must use 40R smart growth to respondents are strongly encouraged to use 40R smart growth. I think Jeff addressed that in one of his emails, that we wanted to make sure that the requirement that they must use it didn't unduly limit us if something came up where there was a better option. And then bringing you all down to the criteria itself. I apologize, you may hear some construction noise in the background. So let's see, I think what the change was. Actually, I don't think there were any changes to this since the last time we talked. It was mostly those upper pieces.
I think the one question that I would like to bounce off the group is in the criteria under schedule.
Yeah.
We only touched on it briefly, but the school department, who has maintained the buildings, forever, did provide a document which was a summary of their operational costs, and it's to demonstrate that the buildings will take someone will need to be responsible for the buildings, and we have a period of time that could be short between the end of school this year and selecting a developer. Like, that's kind of the shortest window. that the city will be responsible for paying for all the things that get associated with maintaining the buildings. A middle term would be that there's some period of time that if and when a developer is selected, the city still maintains those costs. Because I think the conversations that we just need to be aware of is that I think the most unfortunate thing for us right now is that we are going to release this RFP at a time when construction costs are at their highest and most unpredictable. And one of the things kind of going back to this, things that the city can do or offer as an incentive might be that the city continues to pay for some maintenance costs for some period of time. And that could be a year or could be 2 years, for example, where the city is paying for those costs while the developer puts together all the financing. But I think in the long run, the city, if we are not successful with the developer, or if they retain the buildings, then there are big costs that would stack up year after year for some longer period of time. So on a schedule, I wanted to ask, because I think we do not want to require a developer take those costs, because I think the fear is that it could be prohibitive if we absolutely require that the city is just wiping its hands clean and the developer has to come up with those funds at the front. It could be challenging. So I think what we wanted to propose was that it is a evaluation criteria. So there's sort of the shortest period of time. If in a developer, we would ask for a developer to tell us how long they need and before they can take over the costs. Right. So Emily, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but there's the short term, which would be desirable. There's some kind of midterm length of time that the city would have the costs, and then there's something longer. And we want to try to have that as part of the evaluation criteria. And I do see that Brad raised his hand with a question, I think.
So do you know specifically what the cost is for maintaining the schools? And is that something that the city itself pays for, or is this built into the school's budget? Because I'm thinking right now with the contemporary issue of cutting the school budget, if another 18 months of covering those costs, I'm just kind of curious who pays for that and what that dollar amount is, because this could be the difference between something that is incredibly advantageous or also very volatile.
Yeah.
So do you know what that number is?
We do, yes. And I think the first answer is that the school committee voted already to release the properties, and the last part of that is that they will issue a letter the day that they're done, and it's projected to be in the middle of July, or it could slide to August as they're emptying the buildings. But let's say by August, the school department will no longer carry these costs. So in some ways, that's beneficial to some of the other discussions that are happening. These costs come off of the school department responsibility, and it goes directly to the city. We did get a document which I would say is a very conservative look at the costs, and they estimate that it's for all three buildings combined, the cost is $220,000 per year. You could break it, and they break it down per building, and for purposes, it could be slightly lower. Some of the conversations that did come up were that they may not need to heat the buildings at 68 degrees all winter because there's no students, but they have to keep the building at some temperature below that so that the pipes don't freeze. So there will always be heat. There's always a person who needs to inspect these buildings. That has come up is that they're very old and finicky. So they're not set it and forget it. So there would be at a minimum, there'd be a weekly walkthrough. There would be snow clearing. There would be all kinds of things that are all packed into that chart. But the conservative estimate is $220,000 per year for the schools to be properly maintained so that they don't fall into disrepair. So it's definitely not a small number. Yeah. But Brad, did I answer kind of?
Yeah, no, that's good. I just wanted to make sure that we're not doing anything that puts any additional burden on the school system right now. So that's perfectly fine.
Okay, great. So I guess just looking for the final clarity, I see Lauren just raised her hand. I think I just want to confirm that we understand that we don't want to necessarily require the developer to take on these costs, but we do want to incentivize it. Lauren, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, the 40R smart zoning, sorry, can you just remind us what that entails? Like if we don't require a developer to adhere to that, what do we lose?
That's a great question. So the 40R is an overlay district that is like we have it downtown. So Maple Street was already included in it. Center School was included in it, and then we just had this amendment where we added the overlay district over the Pepin School. So now all 3 school properties are included. What it does essentially is it allows the creation of more dense residential housing. So if you didn't use the overlay district, you would be stuck with certain requirements, and you may not be able to get that many units. But the smart growth encourages density in these locations. So a developer could add more units. And so that's the incentive. So some of the ways this works is that a developer it's not that they need to make money, but they need to make their investment whole. And so they bite off a big chunk for an old school like this, or to provide affordable housing, they need more units to make the financial side work for them. And then if the city builds, if a developer builds these units in the smart growth overlay district, the city gets an incentive payment. That's not the overall arching purpose, but it does create money that becomes available for the city to use for various other things. So that taken together, the idea is that we want to focus more dense residential development in these areas. And the city has some level of financial incentive to do that. If a developer chooses not to, what we would expect to happen is that they would apply for what is called a comprehensive permit. It's another way, for housing to get built, especially affordable housing, and it's called a 40B permit. And basically, it just takes away all your zoning requirements. And they do have some public process, but they're not confined to anything. So any of your other zoning that you have, like if you need trees or parking, it's just all wiped away under the premise that the idea is that communities need affordable housing. And so we kind of wanted to discourage the 40B because it takes away a lot of our ability to talk about how a development would look or fit, and it would just give them kind of carte blanche. And the 40R is a more direct way to say, here's where we want this type of development, and we've made the process clearer. So I think the final thing I'll say is that the 40R gives a level of predictability so that a developer can come in, go to the planning board, and if they work out the details, then they get their permit. The 40B and the other process is subject to someone could appeal it. Someone could challenge the decision in court, and what sometimes happens is by doing that, they delay a project to its death. So the 40B is kind of a little bit less desirable, whereas the 40R is a tool that we already have, and we just wanted to see if we can get people to use it.
Thanks.
I did see that Michael Budnick, who has attended our meeting before, wanted to speak. Does anyone object to having Michael speak at this point? He raised his hand.
No.
Okay. Michael, yep, I think you unmuted. Go ahead.
I just wanted to speak under public comment. I noticed in the FAQ you say the best use is for affordable housing, and all of this does seem to be geared towards conversion to affordable housing, which is a wonderful goal that I support. I also noticed in the RFP itself that you referenced that community members have expressed an interest in preserving the gym space. May I also add that community members have expressed an interest in preserving the Pepin Theater space, this as a benefit to the community. Since there is no way that a theater development group could submit a proposal for the entire building that would compete with affordable housing, nor would we want to, does it make sense to write in there that it could be a very important community goal and that community members have expressed a similar opinion to preserve the theater space?
Yeah, I think the auditorium, right, would be the term that is.
Yes.
It's a cafetorium, but auditorium. I mean, I can't speak for the group. On the surface, I don't see a problem with adding the reference to the pep and gym and cafeteria auditorium. It's on a separate level, but I think it did come up in the downtown plan as basically that whole side of Pepin. What we're hoping for is that if a developer can fit this in, and the arrangement that you might expect is that the spaces remain, they get worked on or renovated by the developer, and then there's some kind of opportunity for the public to use the space. But it is balanced by the fact that those are areas that would not be usable for units and people. So it's that balance. But I don't know if any committee members have an opinion on that, or Emily, if you have any response to. I mean, it's all been identified as that is one of the community benefits that would be desirable, and I don't personally see harm in adding it in there.
I agree.
Okay.
Thank you very much for listening to me. I appreciate
Michael,
it.
I did want to say we have definitely heard you, and we've received at least one of the correspondence that you had written. It is included on the website. I did post it as a piece of information that would be available to people so that they understand that there is a group who at least you have a model that you have articulated. So I did want to let you know that we did post that. So the approach we would expect is when we release this RFP, people will really dive into the information that's publicly available, and that is there. So I did want to let you know that.
Well, it's very educational to really understand that it's not really worth it to submit a giant RFP for the building for this particular small use of it, of a portion of it. Just our goal is for anyone who submits an RFP to be aware that we would love for this area to be preserved.
Yes, and I think we're doing that. I think collectively with adding the reference to the Pepin Gym and auditorium, and then including your letter as information for a developer to understand that this has come up publicly. And I'm not trying to, because Michael, I know that you had said previously that you weren't around for the downtown strategic plan, but that this whole idea had come up already. So it's good that you're here and raising it up, but it's not as if it wasn't covered. So I think we're at least trying to really honor the fact that this is, an item for consideration by people. So.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yep. Emily, you're muted.
Sorry, he's muting the construction noise too. I've added it to my notes to make the change to the RFP.
So I know we're moving fast. A lot of this we had covered most of this. So the big picture real quick is that let me take one step back. Sorry. There's two pieces of information that the committee has not seen. One is, actually there's three. The actual land survey. So we have the conceptual plans, which kind of outline the areas. That is really, to me, it's just factual. It's not super critical for the committee, but we do want to embed it in the RFP. The second piece of information that you have not seen is the evaluation of the water, sewer, drainage, the underground infrastructure. And again, that's not going to really change anything, but it is information that a potential developer would be interested in. So I do want to let you know that we're going to embed that into the RFP as the appendices. The last thing is the appraisals. So I have seen a draft of the appraisals, but the company wanted to make some final tweaks to it. And so that is the one thing that, as of right now, I think we would like to move this as a package to City Council, but the appraisals have not come forward. And so maybe I would ask maybe Ben to put you on a spot for a second to say something about the appraisals and Emily. But this is the hardest part, is I think that the appraisals are going to show okay, Chris is going to leave. Thank you, Chris, for sticking around as long as you did. We did briefly talk about this, but the appraisals will generate a number. And I do want us to know that the number is $1 million. It's greater than $1 million that the appraised value of these schools will show. But I think as we look at what's involved in renovating the buildings, you take the value and you invest and you put money in, and you are essentially then lowering the actual value of the building because of the sort of the scale of the buildings and the amount of work that needs to be done to put them into a new use. So I just wanted to air this out a little bit and make sure that people understand that the appraisals is going to be a piece of factual information that goes out, that I think will come up at city council, because I think it goes to just navigating the discussions around, but there's this value and we want to release it for $1. Like, and when I'm not saying that the dollar is the final amount, but it is going to be less than that market value. Ben, do you have anything you would offer for information about how, like, the value of an appraisal?
I mean, I'm certainly no expert at appraisals, property appraisals, but my understanding is the way that these were evaluated is the value for their current use. So this is what, the comparables were charter schools and other uses like that. So if it was going to be reused as a school, this is what it's valued at.
Okay.
Obviously, the discussions that this committee has had is that doesn't even seem to be on anybody's radar as a real possibility. So, I mean, it is what it is. That's what they're appraised at. But like you said, Jeff, when you're trying to reuse a property, whether it's a new building or the existing ones, there's a lot of expense there for that. So that the appraisals aren't really that important when you're the city's trying to accomplish this goal.
Right.
Well, if you want to accomplish this goal, you can't charge $1 million for the property because you're not going to reach that goal.
Right. I think that's helpful, Ben. I appreciate that perspective. And Emily, will you talk about why we did an appraisal? The procurement process?
Yeah, absolutely. So under 30B, which is the procurement process for municipally owned property or state owned as well, you have to issue the RFP through the central registry. You have to advertise it there. And then once you've selected a preferred developer and you've entered into the arrangements, if you are disposing of the property for less than its appraised value, you have to note that in the central registry. You have to put in another advertisement that this was the appraised value. You're disposing of it for less than that appraised value for a public purpose, in this case, affordable housing, and then let them know what it was disposed of for. So it's just a step in the disposition process, part of the transparency requirements for the disposition of publicly owned property.
Thanks.
I think you guys, I mean, you addressed this inevitable question pretty well in the new version of the RFP. I mean, the FAQ, I think. You spell out that whoever comes in and develops these buildings is going to have to spend millions.
Mm-hmm.
So, hopefully that will assuage some people.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Lauren. And I think maybe I would look at it. I mean, what we tried to also say is that this is at some level of the discussion of where we are competing. We are trying to get our community goals fulfilled by people who could be choosing another town. They could choose another community. And, we in Western Mass, we compete for our whole region. We compete. I guess I would say this informally, but like we compete on like not a fair level playing field as Eastern Mass. So Eastern Mass has higher costs, more needs, more people. They generally, and I'd say this generally, but they get access to more money and bigger developers who are closer to larger cities and hubs of activity. So as we march, as you get past Worcester, you go from like this level, this playing field that's this high out there and you're down in Western Mass, it's hard to even get the attention of someone who could find all the ways and means to develop these parcels. So we need to be really at the table to do as much as we can to make these look really appealing and something that people would choose to come here and do this. So, those are the discussions that City Council is going to have. And I think as much information as we can provide, and I think having attendance at a meeting whenever the time is right to say that this is important for us to do. The flip side, I think we wrote this in the FAQ, is one of the only other options is if we want $1 million. Well, as Ben said, maybe we get a charter school, or we're going to get someone who would put in high-end condominiums that would be market rate or higher units. And from what my sitting here for years working on this is that neither of those have been community goals. So that was kind of what we really kind of tried to hit that head on with that FAQ. And Brad, you were going to say something that maybe Ben too.
Yeah, I mean, just based on what you've said already about the maintenance and operating costs to hold on to these buildings, I mean, yes, on the surface, it seems like a loss to not sell those buildings for $1 million. But if we hold on to them for several years, we've already lost that money anyways. So, I think that's an important conversation leveraging point to just say, listen, what we need is an attractive offer so that way we're not paying for these buildings, because, who's to say right now that if we try to sell these buildings for $1 million, if nobody buys them, then every year that goes by, we're losing that money anyways. So I think it's much safer to get the kind of development in that we want, to be competitive and to not risk losing that money in the long run anyways. That's just my opinion. I think probably other people would agree.
That's helpful, Brad. I appreciate that perspective. Ben, did you want to add anything to that or not?
Yeah, I was just going to add, kind of thinking about it, the root of market rate or high-end housing. I think even then, that would be very difficult to do, even giving them away. But certainly with a $1 million price tag, I don't think somebody would touch the project, because essentially in the state, the costs are similar across the state for this type of project, but the revenue potential is much different. I mean, you're not going to generate the revenue that you generate out in the eastern part of the state. So it's hard to do projects like this, and they really do require a certain amount of subsidy, and that includes kind of giving them away.
Right.
I would completely agree with Ben on that. And to Brad's point, not only is it the operating costs that the schools have identified, just to sort of keep everything ongoing, but if you're holding it for multiple years, you're going to have repairs coming in to that point. You're going to have to be, there's going to be weather-related damage. There's going to be, all of that's going to come in. And so that $1 million could go very, very quickly, even if the town just held those schools for another, 4 years. So I think that $1 million disappears rapidly, either way you look at it.
Great. I mean, this is a really great discussion, and Brad, as our city council rep, I think they will all play out again. But I think this was the whole idea, was to have the FAQ and some of this information available. I would hope that the committee, we can pull people in and we'll rehab these discussions, but just to have the information a little bit more readily available, I think that was ultimately the goal. In discussing this real quick, the last thing I just wanted to throw out, I think it's the last thing, is just in the FAQ, did we properly say that the reason we had the appraisal was for procurement purposes? Because I think I just want to make sure that if we didn't specifically say that, I think it would be good to articulate that the reason why we did the appraisal was because we we're anticipating lowering the value, and in order to even have the discussion of lowering the value, we need to have the appraisal first. So that would be the potential one amendment that I would want to just make the committee aware of, that we might try to work in a sentence about that into the FAQ before we button it up. And
I
then,
don't think it's there. So.
okay, so I think if we added that, I think it'd be helpful. And then just as a reminder, Emily had shown us what this could look like with a InDesign kind of this. We just kind of worked in the Word file for now, but I think one of the things we will do as we finalize this is flip it back into that format that was really more appealing for people to kind of like look through. I just wanted to throw those couple things out before it got too late here. So I think with that, are we missing anything? Anybody? Did we fail to discuss anything that we maybe had on the list, or does anyone have any questions?
No, I mean, as I was like looking at different things, I tried to anticipate the thought processes of some of my colleagues on the council and the types of questions that they ask and the things that they look for. And, I think that this looks pretty good. And I think that it will kind of check all those cognitive boxes of other folks on the council and the types of things that they would be looking for. So I think this looks really good.
Thanks, Brad.
I think it's looking good.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. Yeah, I mean, that's the goal is I think to Brad's point, this is not to say that the discussions won't come up. It's just that we do want to refer to the FAQ because it did come up previously. And if we can just walk people through the conversations that have been had, I mean, I do think that's going to be quite an exercise. But that was why we spent the last year doing this, is so that we can help the city council members get up to speed and understand the if this then that kind of scenario. And then we're looking to see, depending on how long it takes in the city council subcommittee process, but if we can release this in July, I think that's pretty optimistic, but I think that should be our goal. Until we can't meet that, it shifts out a month. We did shift some of the timeline around a little bit in the RFP. One of the things we pushed, based on where we are at, we pushed getting proposals back to like October, because that was the other anecdotal piece of information that we have heard is the more time a team, because this is a big ask. So the more time a team has to look at the buildings and look at all the things, the better. We don't want to say turn this around in 2 weeks, because that's just not realistic. So we did stretch that out a little bit. So that timeline has been updated. Great. Well, I think if anyone comes up with questions in the next couple days, feel free to email. But otherwise, I'm really appreciative of everyone's time so far on this. It's been really a good process to have the sounding board kind of opportunity here. We will call on you to attend a couple meetings along the way to just help articulate that we've talked about all these things. And so as soon as there's a schedule for that, I'll let you know.
So does that conclude the committee? Are we done now, or what is the next step from here? Yeah,
I guess with a little bit of sadness, I do think that this would be sort of the final kickoff, kicking this whole package of material to the city council. So I think the formal responsibility of the group would be over. The informal hope is that we can pull some or all of you into one or more of the city council meetings at sometime in June or July. But I think Brad, I think you're right. And I think there is another set of questions about a selection committee that I think my understanding is that the mayor will be looking at. You guys are all listed as potential candidates to review proposals, but that, to my knowledge, that hasn't been fleshed out yet. So city council may have, opinions on that too. So that could be a later step that is not part of this group though.
It's been a pleasure working with you all during this process.
Yeah, it's been really fun. It's been a great onboarding process, the city council, to just really see how all of these things happen in tandem with the work that happens on city council. So thank you all for the learning experience and for dedicating your time to making our community a better place to live. So thank you.
Yeah. So I think with that, I think we will adjourn, and I really appreciate it. And we'll be back in touch. This is not, I mean, it's the end of a formal process, but I think we're still going to be moving this forward. And I would expect an email from me in a week or two, as soon as we can kind of iron out where this goes and what the schedule will look like. So
fingers crossed for good progress.
yeah. Thank you. I like that.
Jeff, can you stay on with me for a few minutes?
Sure. Yep.
Thanks.
And maybe Emily, can you stay on too for a second too? I have 2 questions, but great. So I think Brad, Lauren, and Pamela, thank you very much. And I'm sure I'll see you around town at some point here soon.
Yep. All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
This government meeting is brought to you by Eastworks and our local cable subscribers.